Dorothy Shields had worked in Motown's accounting office for 4 years, and in 4 years she had learned one thing. The numbers always told the truth before the people did. It was a Tuesday morning in late January, 1971. The office smelled like burned coffee and the wet wool of coats that hadn't fully dried from the commute. Dorothy pulled the weekly sales report from the telex machine, read the top line, set the paper down on her desk, and read it again. Then she picked it up a third time and walked it to her supervisor's office without knocking. 200,000 copies. In 7 days. Not across a month, not a quarter. One record, 7 days. The album was called What's Going On, and 3 weeks earlier, Berry Gordy had told the people around him it was the worst thing he'd ever heard come out of one of his studios. She stood in her supervisor's doorway holding the paper. He looked at the number. Then he looked up at her, then back at the number. He reached for his phone. Nobody in that building had expected this. That was the part Dorothy kept coming back to as she walked to her desk. Not the size of the number, the surprise. Because everyone in that building had been told, in one way or another, directly or not, that this album did not have an audience. That what Marvin Gaye had made in those sessions was too serious, too unfinished, too far from what Motown sold. And now here were the numbers, sitting on the telex paper, doing what numbers always did. The atmosphere inside Motown's West Grand Boulevard offices had shifted quietly since October. Not the tension of a label chasing a deadline. Something slower. A held-breath feeling that nobody named out loud. Marvin Gaye had not recorded a single note in 11 weeks. He wasn't in a hospital. He wasn't in another studio with someone else. He had simply stopped. No calls to producers, no sessions booked, no cassettes left at the front desk. His assistant would ring every few days with nothing to report, which everyone understood was itself a kind of message. The people who knew him well enough to push got nothing useful in return. Marvin would sit in the living room of his house on Outer Drive and talk about other things. The weather, his kids, what he'd been reading. If anyone brought up the studio, he'd let the subject go quietly. The way you'd let a door close at the end of a long hallway. No slam, just the soft click of something shut. What Marvin had handed Berry Gordy in October was 9 songs. No lead singles, no dance tracks, no love interest. The album opened with a question, "What's going on?" and refused to answer it cleanly for the next 40 minutes. There were songs about the war, about bodies coming home in boxes, about what it looked and smelled like to stand on a street corner in Detroit in 1970 and try to reconcile the country you'd been told about with the one actually in front of you. Berry listened to it once. Then he called Marvin into his office. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. The people working in the adjacent offices could hear Berry's voice through the wall, but not the words. They heard Marvin's voice twice, both times short. When Marvin came out, he walked down the hallway without slowing down. He took the elevator to the ground floor. He got in his car. That was October. What almost no one outside Marvin's family understood was where the album had actually come from. His younger brother Frankie had enlisted in 1967. He was 20, and he believed in what he was being sent to do. He wrote letters home, to their mother mostly, sometimes to Marvin, and in the beginning the letters said what you'd expect. He was okay. It was hard. He missed home. Then the letters started to change. It wasn't one thing. It was the way certain sentences stopped before they finished. The way Frankie would describe something ordinary, a meal, a card game, the sound of rain on a tin roof, and then move somewhere else in the next paragraph, somewhere that felt like it was trying not to be where he'd just been. There were letters that arrived with words crossed out, not by the Army censors, by Frankie himself, like he'd started a thought, read it back, and decided it had gone somewhere he wasn't ready to send. Marvin kept them in a drawer beside his bed. He didn't bring them up in interviews. He didn't play them for anyone. But those who spent real time with him in 1969 and into 1970 noticed something different about how he occupied a room. He would stop mid-sentence and not pick the thread back up. He started spending evenings with musicians who had nothing to do with the Motown system. Jazz players, people who read, who argued about things with no commercial application. He'd sit for long stretches without filling the silence, which for Marvin was unusual. He was playing Frankie's letters in his head on a loop. The specific way Frankie wrote about coming home on leave and walking through Detroit, feeling like a man who had arrived from somewhere that didn't have a name yet. The way Frankie would describe standing in a room full of people he'd grown up with and not being able to explain why he felt so far away from all of them. The way certain lines and certain letters just stopped mid-thought, as though Frankie had decided the sentence had already gone far enough. Marvin wrote melodies in notebooks he didn't show anyone. He'd sit at a piano in a back room and work through progressions without recording them. He wasn't building towards something he could describe yet. He was carrying something that hadn't found its shape. What came out of that process wasn't a protest record in the sense the term usually gets applied. Protest implies a clear target, a direction for the anger to travel. What Marvin had written was something quieter, closer to grief that has had enough time to become a question. When he sang What's Going On, it didn't land as accusation. It landed as a man asking something he genuinely could not answer alone, something he needed the room to help him with. That was the thing Berry couldn't locate in the album, or wouldn't, or simply had no existing category for. The album got released in January not because Berry changed his mind. It got released because a Motown executive named Barney Alce pushed it through distribution while Berry was focused elsewhere. Barney had listened to the record more than once, and he had made a private decision that the label was making a mistake it would not be able to explain later. Berry found out when Dorothy's telex came across his desk. 200,000. 7 days. He called Marvin that morning. Marvin was at home on Outer Drive. The call was short. Nobody was in the room with either of them. So what was said between them belongs only to what both men carried afterward. What people in the building observed was this. Berry walked back to his office after the call and told his assistant to hold the afternoon. He sat with the door closed for close to 2 hours. When he came out, he didn't say much, but one of the women who had been with the label since its earliest days on Hitsville said she noticed something on his face she hadn't seen there before. Not embarrassment exactly, not admiration, something that didn't have a ready name. The expression of a man who had been very certain about something and was now holding that certainty a little differently. Marvin came back to the building the following week. He walked through the hallway the same way he always had, nodded at people, stopped near the front desk for a few minutes. Somebody handed him a coffee and he stood there drinking it, while a conversation happened around him. Not exactly part of it, but not separate from it either. He looked, by all accounts, exactly the same as he always had. That was the thing about him that people found genuinely difficult to put into words. He didn't carry his decisions on the outside. The 11 weeks of silence, the record Berry had rejected, the refusal to soften or revise, none of it sat visibly on his face or in how he moved. He walked through the building the same way he always had, slightly inside himself, a few steps removed from whatever room he was standing in. Dorothy saw him near the copy machine that week. She had the original telex printout in her hand. She'd been running copies for the permanent file. She thought about saying something. Congratulations, maybe, or just, I saw the numbers. She didn't. She went back to her desk and filed the report where it belonged. The album sold another 100,000 the second week, then more the week after. By spring, it had passed 1 million. By the end of that year, it was being placed on lists alongside records that had been considered untouchable. By the end of the decade, the conversation had moved somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that had nothing to do with Berry's initial reaction or Motown's release calendar. Marvin never made another album exactly like it, and not for a lack of ability. What that record had required of him wasn't a technique or a sound. It was the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent years adjusting himself to fit inside a shape that had never been built for him, and who had finally, quietly without announcement, decided to stop adjusting. He had spent over a year sitting with Frankie's letters before he ever sang those songs in a studio. He wasn't trying to make something that would perform commercially. He was trying to answer the question his brother had sent home from the other side of the world without meaning to ask it, about what all of this was actually for, about whether the things the country told itself in the mirror every morning had any relationship to what was happening out on the street. He didn't get a clean answer. Neither did anyone who listened. That was the point. Barney Else left Motown in 1976. He gave interviews for years afterward and was asked about what's going on in almost everyone. He always said the same thing, that he hadn't pushed the album through because he thought it would perform. He pushed it through because it was honest, and honest things, in his experience, found their way to people eventually. He was right. He just hadn't expected the speed. Dorothy Shields worked in that building until 1984. The original Telex, the one with the 200,000, stayed in the bottom drawer of her desk for 13 years. Not framed, not mentioned to anyone, folded inside a plain envelope she'd labeled in pencil and set behind the hanging files. She brought it to the memorial service in April of that year. She sat in the back of the room and listened. She didn't take the envelope out of her bag. Some things you just don't hand back.